Previously on part 1, we imported the necessary clips and audio, located the bits, adjusted the timing of the clips according to those bits, and finally we created an object to animate. But before we get into animating, we have to know what properties are there to animate. This is an apple. Now, if I ask you what you can do with it, what would you say? Well, I would cut into pieces, I would make it explode, or even make it double. Why? No, I meant the basic stuff like moving the apple. Oh, right, I would move it around. That's it, you can change the position of the layer. I'd make it bigger or smaller. Exactly, you can scale it up or down. I'd rotate it. Yeah, rotation. I'd make it disappear. Yep, the transparency, aka opacity. Well, these are the basic properties you can animate. You can find them all in the transform panel. But who is this guy? Simply put, the anchor point is the point from which all transformations are manipulated. What I mean by that is, this is the anchor point. And if I change the anchor point position to something around here and control the rotation, you can see that it's transforming relative to the anchor point. The same goes for the scale property. Now, the way I control the anchor point is from the transform menu, in which you notice that when I change the anchor point value, the layer's position is also changing, which is not ideal in most cases. For instance, in this case, I want the anchor point to be in the center of the layer. So, if I try to control the anchor point from the transform menu, the position of the layer is also changing. Which is kinda annoying because I have to put this layer back in where it used to be. That's why most animators never control the anchor point from the transform menu. Instead, they use this tool called the Pan tool, which you can find in the toolbar. You can also use the shortcut Y. And with that tool being selected, you can move the anchor point position without messing up the position of the layer. Pro tip: hold Ctrl and double click the tool icon to set the anchor point to be in the center of the layer. Alright, let's preview the first portion of the video. We see a sequence of scaling up, then scaling down, followed by some rotation and effects. We'll break it down step by step, starting with scaling. But first, parent the footage to the null layer. Next, let's get the scaling. Select the null object and open up the transform options. You will find the scale property there. Now, the conventional way of finding it is like digging. But there is a better way to do this. Shortcuts. Each of these properties has its own shortcuts. It's basically the first letter of their name. Position, it's P. Scale, S. Rotation, it's R. Opacity. Now, this one is a little different. Instead of O, it's T. Why? Well, perhaps because it's related to transparency, represented by T. Now that we know the shortcuts, let's put them to use. To start animating the scale, press S to reveal the scale property. Click on the stopwatch. You will see this diamond-shaped icon just planted here. It's called a keyframe. Keyframes are the backbone of animation. They are like markers in time that let you specify when and how changes occur in a layer or effect property. Imagine this, you are a god. Seriously, and afterward is your world building tool. You have the power to decide what happens, how it happens, and when it happens in the world you are creating. When you import files, you are choosing what exists in this world, like trees, hills, clouds, and even birds. And just like you can decide what exists, you can also decide how it exists. For example, you can make the trees sway in the wind, make the clouds move across the sky, and even make the bird fly. And most importantly, you decide when all of this happens. That's where the timeline comes in. Now, the world we just built is nothing but a still image. None of these things are alive. Keyframes are what make everything come alive. For instance, take this bird. It's not alive, but I want to animate it as if it were. As the creator, I can decide how and when this animation happens. I want this bird to fly from one point to another in 3 seconds. In the timeline, you will see numbers indicating seconds from left to right. 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. You can also see the seconds and millisecond on the left side. This line here on the timeline is the time indicator or playhead. It shows you exactly where you are in time. When we create a keyframe, it's going to be placed at the exact position of the playhead. So let's make the bird fly. Therefore, let's find the bird layer. Here it is. Select the layer and press P to open up the position property. It's the movement we want, so it's the position we should animate. Before creating the keyframe, remember that when we create a keyframe, it's going to be placed at the exact position of the playhead. So check where the playhead is. It's at the 4th second. So move the playhead back to 0, because that's the beginning. Click on the stopwatch icon, which shows our keyframe. This will be our initial frame. This is how it starts. Next, we want to make it move to this position in 3 seconds. So move the player to the 3-second mark, then adjust the bird position to where we wanted. You can see that After Effects automatically creates a keyframe for this new position. If you play it from the beginning, you can see that the bird is flying to where we wanted in 3 seconds. I know it's not exactly flying, but you get the idea. Well, you see this diamond icon we just created? Yes, it's the keyframe. But it's actually just one of 4 keyframe types in After Effects. And this diamond shape, that's called a linear keyframe. But before we dive into all the different types, there is a basic concept you need to understand about how After Effects handles keyframes. Spatial interpolation and temporal interpolation. I know these terms may sound scary, but they are actually pretty simple. I just created a simple animation with these 3 keyframes. Nothing special. The first keyframe represents the initial frame. Then after 1 second, I move the ball to this position. Finally, at the 2-second mark, I move the ball to its final position. If you look closer, you will see a line path indicating the movement of the ball. This path is called a motion path, and I can change it. Let's go to the second keyframe. If I adjust the ball position, you will see the motion path changing accordingly. Additionally, I can make the path curve using the pen tool. Simply select the pen tool. Hover over the path point until the icon changes. Then click and drag to create a curve. Now when you preview the animation, you will see it moving along the curve. This explains what a motion path is. If you get what a motion path is, then you can easily understand spatial interpolation. But what is interpolation in the first place? Well, interpolation is how After Effects fills the gap between keyframes by calculating the movement and timing between them. Instead of jumping from one keyframe to the next instantly, After Effects generates all the in-between frames to create the animation. There are 2 types of interpolation, spatial and temporal. In simple terms, spatial interpolation deals with the shape of the motion path, and temporal interpolation deals with the timing of the animation. If you look closely at the motion path, you'll notice 2 things: the line and the dots on it. The line represents the spatial aspect, the shape of the path. The dots represent the temporal aspect, the timing. I know it's a bit tricky, so let's focus on spatial interpolation first. You can see the motion path and its shape is linear, meaning it's a straight line giving a harsh motion. We can make it Bezier, meaning smooth, by adding curves to the motion path like this. Now the movement is smooth, which means I am manipulating the spatial interpolation here. You can do this with a click of a button. Select all the keyframe, right click, go to keyframe interpolation, and you will see the spatial interpolation is set to linear. Change that to Bezier. Click OK and you will notice that the motion path becomes smooth. In this way, After Effects automatically creates curves to the motion path for us. Next, let's talk about temporal interpolation, which, as I mentioned before, deals with the time. If you look closely, you'll notice many dots along the motion path, representing the layer's position at different points in time. By pressing the key page up, you can move forward frame by frame and see the layer's trace represented by these dots. That being said, if I bring the keyframes closer together, you'll notice that the number of dots decreases. If I move the keyframes further apart, the number of dots increases. More dots means slower movement. Fewer dots means faster movement. The distance an object moves per frame depends on the time between keyframes. Shorter duration means faster movement and fewer frames. Longer duration means slower movement and more frames. A quick side note, the total number of frames available in the animation also depends on the frame rate of the composition. You don't need to worry about all the technicalities. Just know that this is what's happening behind the scenes to create the animation. So this is temporal interpolation, where you control the timing of the animation. Now that you understand interpolations, let's get into types of keyframes. 4 types of keyframes, each with their own way of doing things. Let's start with the most common keyframe, and the type that you'll automatically start with in After Effects, the linear keyframe. This keyframes creates a uniform rate of change between keyframes. This means the motion of the animation has no acceleration or deceleration. It stays at a consistent speed, giving a somewhat mechanical look to the animation. An example would be the classic DVD logo bouncing around the screen without any change in speed. While linear keyframes are useful for specific situations, they are typically not the best choice for most dynamic animations. Auto Bezier. Select all the keyframe, hold Ctrl and click on one of the keyframes. Just like that, you turn them into an Auto Bezier keyframe. Auto Bezier takes linear keyframe and smooths out the timing. This means it changes the temporal interpolation, giving the motion a slightly more fluid feel. You can verify this by selecting all the keyframes, right click, and choose Keyframe Interpolation. And you will see that the temporal interpolation is switched to Auto Bezier. If you look at the movement, it's almost identical to the linear keyframe, meaning the change in timing is very subtle. In a nutshell, Auto Bezier makes the animation flow a bit more naturally by adding subtle acceleration and deceleration to the speed of the animation. However, it's rarely useful in practice because it lacks the precise control we get with Bezier keyframes. Yes, Bezier keyframe, indicated by an icon that kind of resembles an hourglass shape. This keyframe is probably the most useful keyframe among animators because Bezier is where you have full manual control and functionality over the graph. Select all the keyframe, right click and go to Keyframe Assistant. select ECs or simply press F9. Now if you look at the motion path, you'll notice something interesting. There are more dots at the start and end, and while the middle has fewer dots. More dots means slower movement, while fewer dots mean faster movement. So as the ball moves, it starts slowly, speeds up in the middle, and then slows down as it reaches the end, giving a smooth animation. And this keyframe is going to be our go-to throughout this tutorial. A whole keyframe has no interpolation. Select all the keyframe, right click and choose toggle whole keyframe, or press Ctrl plus Alt and click on the keyframe. When you look at the motion path, you'll notice that there are no dots, meaning it has no interpolation. The animation will instantly jump from one keyframe to the next without any in-between frames or motion. This creates a pause effect by freezing the value of animation property until the next keyframe. This is also great for freezing a particular frame of video. Select the video layer, right click, go to time and choose freeze frame. Just like that, the frame is frozen. Understanding keyframe is just the first step. The real fun begins when you start applying it creatively. That being said, let's get back to where we left off. We create a keyframe of scale property. Why? Well, to create the scale movement at the start. Slide the keyframe to where the first scaling starts. Then move the player to where the scaling ends. And increase the value until you get almost the exact scaling, around 130. That's the first movement. Now for the second movement, the scaling out, we'll create one more now. If you ask why, well, it's easier to show than to say. So create a null object. Use the shortcut Ctrl Alt plus Shift Y. Parent the first null to the new null. And select the null and open up the scale. Add a keyframe where the next movement starts. Then move the playhead to the end of that movement and decrease the value all the way down. The reason we create a second now, so that I can now overlap the keyframes. Okay, if you play that out, we got the animation. Scaling in followed by scaling out. But something big is missing. Yes, the timing. And if you can recall, we introduced it by another name. Exactly, the temporal interpolation. And to control the timing of the animation, I introduced the graph editor, in which you have these two guys, speed graph and the value graph. Okay, that's a lot to take in for one video. Seriously, if you made it this far, props to you, because most people probably click off by now. So how about we catch our breath and pick this up in the next part.
Hey,